Hello lovelies. Today we're going to take a look at the 2024, even though it is 2025, edition of the Monster Manual for the Big Daddy role-playing game, Dungeons and Dragons. Now this is a lukewarm take. I know plenty of other people have already had their takes, but in an age when simultaneous publishing or streaming or whatever is the thing, for reasons best known to themselves, Wizards of the Coast decided to release these things staggered around the world. So yeah, that's why it's a lukewarm take after everyone else has done it. Even so, this is likely to be a video that reaches beyond my normal audience, typically. So hello, please subscribe, leave a comment, whatever. When I do book reviews, I do them like this on my messy desk, which is cluttered with role-playing stuff and booze and and things, and from which I run games, streamed typically, including a D&D game, which is why I actually bothered to buy these. Otherwise, and that being a paid gig, I probably wouldn't have bothered. So if that gives you some idea of my sort of biases going forwards, fair enough. When I review things, I give them 2 scores, style and substance, both out of 5. Then I combine those to give us a rating out of 10 or a rating out of 5. 3 out of 5 is average. That is, you know, kind of what I expect from whatever that game is. Anything higher than that is good and increasingly worthwhile getting. Anything below that is bad and increasingly not worthwhile getting, but you can adjust the scores up and down a bit depending whether something is something you're interested in or not. And I do use the full scale, so anything 3 or above or 6 or above is good. You know, even a 7, it doesn't mean it's a bad game. A lot of reviewers don't use the full gamut of scores. I do, but I tend to be a little bit forgiving. Alright, so this is the alternate cover special edition version. It's getting on for 400 pages, 384 I think. It's hardback, it's full colour, kind of, but there's no ribbon, so none of the little touches, bells and whistles that you might get from independent RPGs that go hard into the kind of quality side of things. And it's a bit of a bitch to review because a monster manual is ultimately just a big book of monsters, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a list essentially, writ large, of creatures, and you know, that is what it is. It is what it is. It's full of entries for creatures. Most of them illustrated, but by no means all of them, in various ways, and it has the full statistical breakdown and a little bit of extra stuff on each of the kinds of creatures that there are. So, I mean, you know pretty much what you're getting, but how does it hold up against other books of monsters from the past? How does it compare to D&D's past? Are all the classics in here or not? It's bigger than previous editions, I think, I'm almost certain, so it contains a lot more entries, so you will find a lot more monsters. There's a few weird things that are missing that are kind of staples of D&D, like various humanoid enemies, though others are present, some are conspicuously absent, which is a little bit weird. There's a few different monsters, which helps keep things fresh, and I think partly that's done because this is more like continuity 5th edition than it is a completely new edition. Where you'll find the tweaks is mostly in character creation, the interpretation of some of the spells and so on, but statistically and so on, the real mechanics of the game are broadly remain the same. So there hasn't really been a need to overhaul on that basis, which I'm sure made things a lot easier. The creatures within these pages are mostly slightly tougher than the 2015 edition by around half to 2 sort of challenge ratings, or slightly more. And I think this is necessary to compensate for the increase in power that player characters have gone throughout, the earlier edition. Which is kind of interesting, but I don't know that this is the right way to go, really, because now you're into an arms race, right? So player characters get more and more options, become tougher and tougher, harder to kill. Monsters being revised, not so much, if at all, gradually drop back and become easier and easier to slay in a game that started off on the high fantasy heroic sort of end of the scale. And now you try to compensate by boosting up the effectiveness of the monsters, but now we're into sort of a new edition, which means if past form is held to, then characters will get tougher and tougher again as this edition progresses, and so these monsters will be left behind. And then what do? Do you release an update that makes them tougher again? And then what, the player characters continue to get... Eventually it gets ridiculous. So I'm not sure that this was the approach, rather than making the game deadlier and characters weaker in the player's guide, which is probably where they should have done it. But that might be a more old school form of role-playing biasing my thinking. Not that I'm really that old school. I've always been more on the, caught between the kind of story gaming side and the old school side. I'm always somewhere in the middle, despite protestations from other people to the contrary. There's some nice things in here. I like the arch-hags. They're a nice addition because they mean hags can be used as opponents or masterminds or big bads. Going into higher levels, they become a lot more powerful and effective. Though there isn't a lot of thought really given to long-term effects that having these creatures in your neighborhood might have. A lot of spells, while powerful, have been nerfed in terms of how long they have their effect for, and so on. So the rules don't necessarily support the narrative. You could, in theory, have a hag that has managed to charm or otherwise manipulate a whole village using magic, but the rules won't support that. And when the players go to use charm spells or similar, they're not going to be able to, and so you run into a conflict between the narrative that you want to present and the rules as written. And yeah, you can ignore the rules, but that causes bigger long-term problems with verisimilitude, consistency within the game, the scaffolding of rules supporting story, all the rest of it. So yeah, there's a lot of very kind of generic humanoid attackers, which is good on one side because I always tended to find the humanoid NPCs entries to be a bit lacking, not spread out enough over various levels and so on. So it's nice to have them, but they're really, really quite generic. And given race essentially means nothing in the current edition, mechanically that's fair enough and it ties together, but it also fails to differentiate and characterize between, a half-orc bandit, no, there are no half-orcs, an orc bandit and a half-giant bandit. There's no mechanical difference between them, which is the case with players, but it does mean that everything's just cosmetic when it comes to NPCs. You could have fixed that to an extent by having sort of race or ancestry or kin or species or whatever the nom de jour is to layer over it, to assign to these things, to give them a bit more flavour. That could have gone a long way. That is definitely one thing I miss from 3rd edition, is the idea of templates that you can apply to turn a creature into an alpha, or a giant something, or whatever. And that's definitely missing from these, which is unfortunate. In fact, there are no real guidelines for creating your own monsters or modifying the monsters particularly, so you're kind of stuck with what they present you with, if you care about challenge rating and encounter balance and all of those sorts of things that a lot of people do care about. Maybe they'll put that in a separate book, but it feels a bit of a shitty thing to do, to not at least give us a hint as to what the maths is that they're using to come up with the challenge rating for these creatures and the values for these creatures and so on. There's been much talk about the dragon designs. I quite like the new dragon designs. They feel a lot more characterful. I don't think they're all a hit. I think some are good, some are not quite so good, but having really strong visual distinctiveness between different kinds of dragons and restoring dragons to some of their older edition power level, spellcasting, all of that sort of thing, that's good. I'm glad to see that kind of thing back. So that's something that I come down on the side of. A lot of people don't necessarily like them, like the way the gold dragon looks much more like an Eastern dragon now, but I'm okay with it. Even if I don't necessarily like an individual design, I like the idea of having greater differentiation visually and in terms of powers and so on between the dragons. So that's alright. There's a lot of gender swaps, or unnecessary inclusiveness, you might call it, in a lot of different monster types, which seems a little bit weird or a bit ignorant of where some of these ideas and things come from, like male dryads or naiads, for example, or having incubus, succubus as two separate creature entries, despite being the same creature that swaps between different forms, which is actually what the old lore was. But if it's the same creature, why does it have two different stat blocks? The whole thing is a mess. Of course, the idea was that a succubus would visit young men in the night and harvest their seed, and then transmute itself into an incubus and seduce young women and impregnate them with the man's seed, and that would be an excuse people would come up with as to why that person was pregnant and had a baby that was very obviously their child, when, oh, I swear to God, never even touched her. So, yeah. We have male Medusae, even though they already had one in lore. The Madar was a very rare male equivalent of a Medusa. A lot of these monsters that they have dickered with embody classic tropes from myth and folklore, and a lot of them embody avatars of particular inclinations, shadows or eidolons from human psychology, personification of primal archetypes. So changing them in this way is, I think, more destructive to their effectiveness as mythological creatures and so on. It's more destructive to that and their effectiveness as story tools and so on than anything you gain through inclusivity. Less so perhaps when it comes to player characters, but for monsters, to me it feels like it makes them less effective, less mythic, less interesting in a lot of ways. So that's a bit of a shame. Art-wise, yeah, my complaint since 5th edition proper has been that a lot of the artwork is very mushy. There is a lot of pastel mush, and this book has a lot of pastel mush as well, that I don't like. But it is a slight improvement over previous stuff. There's been a slight improvement in the art, in my not so humble opinion, in all of the new books. The covers of the alternate editions are a little bit inconsistent, and internally it's a little bit inconsistent. There was a much more hard graphical style to some pieces in the DM's guide, which I appreciated and liked very much. In here, it's all a bit hit and miss. There is a kind of creeping, dreadful cutesiness to some of the art. There are more action-oriented shots, which I like to see, but it seems fairly obvious that a lot of the artists aren't necessarily used to that kind of art and can't necessarily execute it particularly well. And it's by no means all the art. A lot of the monsters appear to be voguing, which is, again, unfortunate. But there has been some improvement, and we should acknowledge that small amount of improvement that has taken place. A lot of the art is very bland, expressionless. It looks like they've used Poser or something and then traced over it with low effort. Honestly, for a lot of the pieces in here, this is going to be hugely damning, but AI can produce better art than some of the people involved here, and this is supposed to be the exemplar of D&D, of the role-playing industry, and it should be supporting artists who can really knock it out of the park and inspire you and make you want to throw these monsters into your games, and it just doesn't necessarily. So when it comes to Wizards specifically, maybe they should go back to using AI, because it produces better work potentially. The big controversy has been the removal of orcs as antagonists. Now, technically, you can say that they're included in things like bandits, pirates, and so on. I think the pirate art, which we'll get to soonish, has some orcs in it, but they're basically just green-skinned humans with an underbite. And so, who fucking cares? Really? They're not Yeah, there we go. I mean, they're not mechanically any different. They're not orky in any sense from any of the various strands of even WoW, which is responsible for the pussification of orcs. It doesn't even evoke that. So yeah, that's unfortunate. But what gets to me is the inconsistency here. If the objection is that orcs are not presented as antagonists because they're player character options, as some people have said, then okay, so are goblins. So are kobolds, and they're present here. So are other races that are present here. If it's that they're humanoid creatures with feelings and culture and consciousness and all the rest of it, then there's a hell of a lot of other humanoid creatures throughout here with intelligence that meet that same set of criteria. So why are they included? Well, I mean, that would just leave you with animals, and then Peter would probably still be onto you. But there's just no consistent reasoning here, other than orcs have somehow become a lightning rod for people who want to get upset about fictional racism for whatever reason, however justified it might be in the game. So that whole thing, I mean, I'm at the point of just kind of rolling my eyes about it, really, but it does seem peculiar that these things are absent, but you'll still include pirates, who historically may have been crews rebelling against unjust captains or seeking freedom, or rescued slaves or escaped slaves, and so on. And it seems odd to include bandits, who often start out as peasants for whom the harvest has failed, things like that, So you can't kill warrior tribes of orcs encroaching and slaughtering farmers, but you can kill dispossessed farmers trying to survive a harsh winter by taking to banditry, and who are victims of their economic conditions. That's fine, apparently. Which I could go on a whole rant about class politics and materialism and things there, but I will spare you. I will spare you that for another week. So yeah, instead of that, instead of orcs, even though you have other creatures with full stat blocks and entries, you have these generic human enemies which lack characterization and statistical differentiation between different species. There is no mechanical difference really between a Goliath and a gnome, so someone explain to me how that makes sense. This book is really broad but really shallow. While you have a lot of monsters, they barely get any sort of ecology of information. Some of them, a lot of them, have little random tables of snippets of things that you can use to modify them, at least narratively, in some way, or to explain where they've come from or what they're guarding or whatever. I don't see myself ever using any of these tables, but some people might find them inspiring. But I could have done with less creatures and maybe an additional paragraph for each one on their ecology, where they're found, why, how, and so on. Instead, we mostly, there are exceptions, but we mostly just get a kind of description of what they are. And that's it, without going into any depth. So that makes for a fairly dull read. It's like, okay, I can see what it is from the picture. And then you're spending your time telling me obvious things about most of them and failing to go into any interesting, deeper depth on any of them, which feels like a waste of the additional space and real estate that they've given over to having more monsters. Your mileage may vary, but I prefer to know a bit more about the creatures and how they might be situated within the fantasy world, how they kind of make sense, a little bit of the deeper lore about them. The last thing I really say about it is that it has rather weird indexing. So while it does collect animals at the end, though it includes some rather exotic ones as animals at the end, otherwise its indexing is purely name-based, which is okay, but it would have been handy to have all the dragons in one section. It would have been happy to have all the devils and demons in one section. It would have been handy to have all the goblinoids in one section, and then to alphabetize those sections within themselves. Instead, the whole thing, apart from animals, weirdly, is just alphabetized. So if you want to look up a black dragon, you don't look up dragons and then find the black dragon. You look under B for black dragon. It's a style preference and choice, I am sure, but I tended to prefer the older way they did it, where they collected like creatures together, as they have with the animal section. So clearly they can do it when they want to. They just didn't want to. Alright, let's give it a score. And this is in the modern context, and in the context of this being D&D, which is the flagship role-playing game for everybody. So keep that in mind. Style-wise, I still hate the pastel mush, and what the fuck is wrong with you? What is wrong with contrasts and vibrance? You take even good pieces and you make them look all by removing any color depth, any vibrance, any contrast to them, presenting them in the worst possible way, where they kind of go and blend into the background. I hate you for that. But the art is an improvement. It's just not much of an improvement, and it's really, really inconsistent. Whoever your art director is, fire them. Get someone who has a lot more experience in graphic design or comics, right? And bring them in. You know, there's a lot of comics people losing their jobs. I'm sure some of them will work relatively cheaply. But bring someone like that in, someone who knows how action can be expressed on a page, someone who knows the importance of strong line work and graphics and color intensity and all of that sort of thing, right? Get people like that in. It is a slight improvement, but it is only a slight improvement. I think previously I gave maybe the DM's guide a 4 for style, because I wanted to encourage more graphical design like we saw in there and the level of improvement we saw in there. But this just isn't good enough for what is meant to be the brand leader for the entire hobby of role-playing games. But it is a slight improvement, so 3.5 out of 5 for style, I guess. In terms of substance, there's more monsters, but it's very shallow, so you don't really go into any depth, which is where I would have preferred the additional pages to have gone. You know, just another paragraph for each creature, not even all of them, sort of explaining their ecology and how they fit into the world in a better way, rather than just describing them, which is the case for most of the entries. But there is a lot here, and of the new books, this is the thing that is the most transferable if you continue to play the previous edition, especially since the creatures in here seem to have accounted at least somewhat for the increase in power of characters over the course of the previous edition. And because the statistics are so completely interchangeable, at least when it comes to monsters for the most part, this is probably still worth picking up if you play D&D, even if it's, you know, baseline 5th edition, because this will slot in nicely and it will recalibrate the difficulty of your encounters and so on as you put them together. So again, I guess that's a 3.5 then for substance, because there are a lot of entries here. What marks it down is just the lack of depth, but it is the most useful to people, even if they're playing continuity D&D. So that's a 3.5 for substance as well. So that is 7 out of 10. 3.5 out of 5. I mean, if you're playing the new edition, you're going to need it. If you're playing the older edition, it's probably worth picking up. If you're not playing 5th edition or a 5th edition derivative, you can pass up this whole edition. You can just keep going with your existing 5th edition stuff. And I think that is really the problem with the 2024 edition. They should have either grasped the nettle and gone with a whole new edition and fixed everything root and branch, and followed the successes they've seen on Kickstarter and so on for things like Shadowdark. You know, a simplification, a rationalization, and a bit more of a contrasting aesthetic, but instead they went for this. And so I think most people have a profound sense of meh and don't really feel the need to update. And so that's kind of where we are. Zang, comment. All hail Algorithmo. Old Fat Punks is part caper, part comedy, part nostalgia, and part commentary. It follows 3 aging punks as they build themselves up for one big, nihilistic last hurrah. You can buy Old Fat Punks at Amazon, Drive-Thru Fiction, or Lulu.com. Follow the links below or search on those sites.